What's up everyone, it's Duncan from 4xtouring.com. In this video, I'm going to talk you through my thought process in buying a new solar blanket. Welcome back everyone. Now a disclaimer before I even dive into this video. I am no expert when it comes to this particular topic. It's just purely I am sharing with you the research that I did in getting to buying a solar blanket which is suitable for my requirements. I did a whole heap of research and I finally concluded on what type of a blanket to get in terms of wattage. And I thought I'd just share that with you. Some of you watching this video might be more knowledgeable or even experts in this topic. So if you are, please do leave comments in the section below. I'd love to learn, and I'm sure there's so many others out there who would love to learn as well. So, what happened? Well, I always had a solar blanket, and I lent it to a friend sometime last year, and unfortunately someone decided to break into his ute, and amongst other things the blanket was taken as well. My friend was nice enough, he offered to pay me back for the blanket that I had, and what I had was a 120 watt blanket, and this time I thought, and the thing was, when I bought that blanket, it was purely based on price. It was a special that was there. I looked at it, 120 watt should be enough for my requirements, and I went ahead and bought it. Not a lot of thought was put into it at that point by me. This time, since I'm now going back into buying a newer blanket, and by the way, at the end of this video I'll tell you why I went for a blanket as opposed to a panel, so keep watching. And by the way, if you're new to my channel is all about sharing my experiences in overlanding with the rest of the community, and I try and bring out a video every single week. So hit that subscription button and the notification bell. You got nothing to lose. And if you find my content useful and of value to you, and you'd like to try and help me out, please head on over to my Patreon's page, and there's various tiers. It's as little as buying me a cup of coffee. Anyway, so when I bought it, like I said, I based it on price, and I didn't put much thought into it. This time I thought I'd rather do it properly. And one of the most confusing things when you come to buying a solar blanket or panel, and especially if you're not so knowledgeable in it like I am, all you get to see is a rating in wattage. So it'll say 120 watts or 150 watts or 200 watts. What does this mean? And if you think about consumption, like how much does your fridge pull, for example, or how much would the your camera batteries when they're charging pull, that's in amperage. So how does the amperage and the wattage, how do you put the two together to try and understand this in layman's terms? So just keep in mind, and we'll do some calculations as we go along in this video, and keep in mind the formula voltage multiplied by amps equals to wattage. Okay, so that already should start making some sense to you, but I'll talk you through the thought process I went through in trying to figure out, for the kind of equipment or accessories I'm running and how much consumption they're pulling, what kind of a blanket I felt would work for me. Now, in my case, I run the Deep Cycle AGM battery, 120 amp hour, but it's AGM, and I did a video on this some time back. I'll leave the link in the description below. You don't really get that entire 120 amps or whatever the rating that the battery comes with. Usable is only about 50%. So in my case, it's 60 amp hours. So how they do the rating is, when they say 60 amp hours or 120 amp hours or whatever the case may be, what they really mean is 1 amp of draw. If you have 1 amp of draw per hour, then it can give you that rating, so 120 amp. So what that means is, theoretically, they're saying that the battery can supply 1 amp of power for 120 hours. Discounted down by 50% for the usable, that means 60. Now obviously you don't pull, your accessories don't pull just 1 amp. It varies. It can be much more than that. So what that means is the amount of usable time in terms of power delivery is that much reduced. So for example, if your total amperage that pulling is 10, then that means you only, going by my example of 60 amp hours usable, that means you only get 6 hours of usable time before the battery goes completely flat. Now, of course, it doesn't work that way. So coming back to my situation, so the first thing I had to do was figure out what my consumption was. So I run 2 fridges, a center console fridge and a 40-liter fridge which sits at the back. The center console fridge doesn't come into the equation because every time I come to the end of the day and we park off, I switch that off. There's no need for me to run that. So that switches off. It doesn't draw on the deep cycle battery. It's the 40-liter fridge that runs continuously. So what I did was I took a multimeter and figured out what draw the fridge does. Now, also keep in mind that the consumption or the draw will depend on the quality of your product as well. Now, there is a reason why we pay high prices for certain products, because that also comes along with a lot of quality in the construction, the build, the design, the technology, and that's involved. Now, the fridge that I run is not the best money can buy, nor is it the cheapest money can buy. So it's kind of like middle of the road, you could say. So the figures that I'm going to work with is kind of moderate, you could say. If you're going to work this out yourself, you need to pay attention to what kind of equipment you've got and what they pull and draw and so on. So my fridge, when I used a multimeter and measured the consumption that my fridge pulls, works out to about, every time the compressor is running, it pulls about 6 amps. Now, just a side note, I did a video some time back, again I'll leave the link in the description below, how I try and keep the fridge running as efficiently as possible, because the lot less the compressor runs, that means a lot less it pulls. Now, coming back to it, so it pulls about 6 amps every time the compressor is running, but that doesn't mean the compressor is going to run continuously for an entire hour. If it is, then you've got a problem and you need to figure that out. In my case, approximately it runs half an hour for every 1 hour, more or less. So that means my consumption per hour is 3 amps. Thereafter, I have floodlights fitted on 3 sides of Dicerus, my 80 series, for those of you who don't know who Dicerus is. And those pull, if I'm running all 3 at the same time, they pull about 3 amps. Now again, with the LED lights, the floodlights, I hardly use them, to be quite honest, because Johnny and I, when we travel, our policy is quite simple. We don't like driving in the dark, or at least we try not to. We try and find a place to camp about 2 hours before sun goes down. We set up camp, super chilled. After all, we're on a holiday. And I carry a whole heap of rechargeable LED lanterns. So most of the time, by the time darkness arrives, we got these lanterns going. So I don't really need those LED lights which are feeding off the deep cycle battery. But nevertheless, for the purpose of this calculation, I brought that in as well. So it pulls about 3 amps per every hour. Now, LED lights, I obviously would not run the entire throughout the night. At best, I would run maybe an hour, but to be conservative into my calculation, I assume that I would run those lights collectively every evening for about 3 hours, right? So that's within a 24-hour cycle. That means my fridge would be consuming 3 amps per hour round the clock. So 3 amps into 24 hours, that is, gives me 72 amps of draw for a 24-hour cycle. The LED camping floodlights at the rate of 3, and I said about 3 hours in total, that's 9 amps within a 24-hour cycle. Then I have my camera batteries, laptop. Again, I hardly use them when the vehicle is parked, because what I try and do is, if I have to charge my laptop battery, or if I have to charge my camera and drone batteries, and by the way, I carry multiple batteries So a lot of the time, the batteries which I take from home last me a fair bit of time. So it's not like I'm charging every single day. But nevertheless, I brought them into my calculation. If I had to charge these batteries, I try and charge them while the vehicle is on the go, so that it, the alternator is already working, and through the DCDC charger, it's charging up my deep cycle. So the draw from these batteries that are being charged, it's not really felt. But again, to be conservative, I brought them into the calculation as well. So I worked on 4 amps being pulled by the laptop, and I thought maybe 2 hours at best while I'm using it or trying to get it charged. So that's 8 amps there, again in the 24-hour cycle. And then all the other batteries for the drones and the cameras and so on, I worked on 3 over a 3-hour period, 9 amps. So what that meant was, in a 24-hour cycle, if I was going to run all those accessories in those number of hours that I mentioned, obviously the fridge would be running right around the clock, I would arrive at 98 amps of consumption over a 24-hour period. If I was purely running this off the battery, and that was not going to get charged when the sun came up, or if I didn't charge the motor, with my battery being 120 amp hour, which is, like I said, usable is only about 60. And if I was to bring that 98 amps down within that period of time, that means it will be consuming about 4 amps per hour. What that meant was my deep cycle battery could supply power for about 6 hours if I was running all these accessories right through, and then eventually it'll run flat. That's not that's not the purpose here. That's not trying to run it just purely off the battery and then it goes flat, and then you've got a problem. So obviously, when the sun comes up in the morning, and if I'm not going to go, or hit the tracks where the engine or the alternator could charge this battery up, you're going to just stay parked and chill out. Then you need to rely on your solar source of power, so whether it's a blanket or a panel, to charge that battery up while still keeping those accessories going in those sort of consumption hours, so to speak, and that I would put them through. So this is where this calculation comes in. So keep in mind, 98 amps drawn in a 24-hour cycle, and what sort of a blanket, or in terms of wattage rating, do I need for it to feed these accessories at the same time keep the battery charged up. Now, before I come to the calculation, another thing you're going to keep in mind is that when the sun comes up, and for a solar blanket or a solar panel to work efficiently, you need to have clear skies with really good sun. If it is overcast or if it is raining, then of course your panel or your blanket will only be that much efficient. And also, again, with your solar panel or blanket, its level of efficiency depends on how well that panel or blanket is built and the technology that goes into the solar cells. So again, it depends on how much your budget is and how much you spend. So the higher you spend, obviously you get some really, really good branded products out there which will perform at its ultimate efficiency. And then if you go one of these cheap, unheard of names, then that's what you get. So again, in my case, the blanket that I eventually settled for is because we are all working with the budget, is kind of like middle of the range, so to speak. So that's another thing that you need to keep in mind when you're going for a solar blanket or panel, right? So the ratings that you get advertised on the packaging or on the advertising itself, it may not necessarily be what you will eventually receive. So it might say, well, 120 watt solar blanket or panel, but it depending on the level of quality of the product, you may not really be getting that. So that's something you need to be aware of. So I knew in my case that if I went for a middle of the range, it may not necessarily give me what the product is advertised at, may or may not be, but nevertheless, I'm kind of happy with that. I certainly wasn't going to go really, really cheap. So let's get back into the calculation. Now, to bring into the calculation, now, yes, the sun comes out, and you could say there's sun up from 6 o'clock in the morning till 6 o'clock in the evening. I've got 12 hours of sun. That's not really correct. For the panel or the blanket to work efficiently, it needs more or less proper direct sunlight. and effectively you might get about, I don't know, about 4 to 5 hours of that. And then, you know, as the sun keeps moving, you need to keep moving your blanket or angling your blanket or panel in the, you know, to get the most directional sun, again on the assumption that this is a clear blue sky. So you don't really get that entire 10 or 12 hours that we would think we would get. Just because there's light out there, it doesn't necessarily mean that the panel is getting exactly what it needs to keep its job going. So again, into the calculation, and from my research, I figured out I'm looking at maybe at the best 6 hours of sun. That's enough for the panel to work at its best or at its most efficient. So now let's get back into it. So total consumption 98 amps over a 24-hour period. Of course, I'm running a 12-volt system. Most of us run 12-volt systems. So if I have to go back to that formula I mentioned, which is voltage 12, which is a given, that's easy, multiplied by amps, or the consumption, 98 amps in my case. So 12 multiplied by 98 gives me 1176 watts. Now, of course, there's no solar blanket or solar panel out there, at least for the recreational market, that will give me 1176 watts. In fact, if you had one of those, you'll be already over your GVM carrying something like that around. So no, that's not how it works, because you remember what I said was you got a certain amount of efficient daylight available for your blanket to operate at its maximum, and I'm working it out on approximately 6 hours. So you take that 1176 and you divide it by 6, and when you do that, I come to figure 196. What that means is what I need is about 196 watts of solar charging that will keep my battery topped up and these accessories going. So of course, that will be the nearest for me would be a 200 watt blanket. I was going for a blanket. Like I said, I'll mention to it at the end of the video why I decided on a blanket instead of a panel. So whether you're going for a blanket or panel doesn't matter. It's 196, meaning 200 watt. Now, ideally, I would have said to myself, well, 200 watt, but because I am not going for the best money can buy, obviously the efficiency would be a little bit less. Therefore, maybe a 250 watt panel or blanket would be more ideal. So leaving room for that inefficiency, and I'll get my 200 watt. Well, that was not necessary, because every time it goes up that much of wattage, obviously the price goes up as well. And not to mention the weight that you carry around goes up as well, whether it's a blanket or a panel. So remember I said the figures that I came up with was on the conservative high side, and also keeping in my mind that I have a very simple system. The only thing that will probably run around the clock consuming would be my fridge. The rest of the accessories, like I said, I try and minimize the use as much as possible. Again, like I said, camp lights, I don't really need them because I've got other lighting sources, like camera batteries and laptops. I would probably charge them, if I had to, once every third or fourth day, depending on use. So it's not really that much of consumption that I'll be having. It'll be most likely the fridge that will be running. So a 200 watt blanket was, in my opinion, within my limited knowledge, was more than sufficient for me. So I went for a 200 watt blanket. So I hope all these figures and the calculations made sense. I will also be doing a blog post on this, and it will be available on the website for anybody who wants to go and do some reading. Now, why did I go for a blanket instead of a panel? Now, again, from the research that I've done, what I've learned is that a panel can be a lot more efficient than a blanket. Now, that means, again, in terms of rating. So what I gathered, and again, you experts who might be watching could leave comments below. From what I gathered was a 200 watt panel would be a lot more efficient because of the technology that goes into it, as compared to, say, a 200 watt blanket of a similar quality grade. But in my case, what I was looking at was convenience of carrying it around. Of course, a blanket, it's a no-brainer. It's a lot easier to carry than a panel, and also it'll be a lot lighter than a panel. Now, of course, you can have your panel mounted on your roof somewhere. What I was looking at was, a lot of the time when I get to a campsite, I try, if available, I try to park under a shade, as we all would want to do. So if I did that, that means, and if I had a panel which is mounted on the roof, that wasn't going to get much sunlight. So I thought a blanket would be a lot easier, because I could go and put the blanket where the sun is. Now, of course, keep in mind, from the blanket, you'll have a cable running to your point where you connect it to your battery. And the longer that cable is, there is going to be a drop off. So again, those figures, when you're working those figures, you need to kind of try and keep that in mind as well, what the drop off would be. So don't make it too long. So it was purely convenience when I decided on a blanket over a panel. If you can go for a panel, and if that works for you, I think that'll be a better deal. So coming back to it, so that's how I arrived, and I went and bought myself a 200-watt solar blanket. I'm not going to mention which brand I bought, because this is not a product review. It was purely to share with you those calculations I went through and my thought process in getting myself a solar blanket. So I hope you found this video useful, if it was of some value to you. If you liked it, please do give it a thumbs up. If you've got questions or comments, please leave them below. Like I said, some of you might be experts in this and are far more knowledgeable than I am in this topic. I'd love to see what you have to say and what your thought processes have been in getting yourself that solar charging system going. If you haven't subscribed already, what are you waiting for? Go hit the subscription button and the notification bell. Like I said, I just love to share my overlanding experiences with the rest of the community. And don't forget to head on over to 4xtouring.com. There is a community content-driven forum, which some of you might find useful. It's a free sign-up. Join up there. Just a few who might be wondering, Dicerus is still not on the road yet, waiting for those diff locks to be installed. Hopefully it will happen in the next week or two. Opposite lock is just chock-a-block with work. And thanks for watching, everyone. I'll see you soon in another video.